You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Friday, folks. Happy Friday evening. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. For all of those of you, easy for me to say, for all of those of you who'd like to go over and see what Odyssey Radio is all about, check out their schedule, find all the places where this show airs. It's over there, odyssey1.com. We are also broadcasting in simulcast in live video over on my YouTube channel, and that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join the chat room and express your opinions, air your views, and have a good time over there with the other Intrepheads. I know last night's episode seemed to spark a little disagreement between some people over in the chat room, and some people are still a little miffed about that. Well, you know what? That happens when you express opinions. It did not end up in a disastrous effect for the chat room, just a couple of people having issues with each other. And you know what? That's okay. That's what open dialogue and discussion is all about. Sometimes if your speech does not offend somebody, you might not be saying the right things. At the same time, as I have always maintained, I can only be offended if I choose to be offended. I choose to fight things that people are intending to use to offend me with common sense and with, hopefully, better information. And if we end up at a stalemate, then we're at a stalemate. We agree to disagree. So come on over. Even those of you who had a couple of words with some other people in the chat room, I hope you're there tonight, and I hope you're enjoying this show. And so now, enough airing of little tiny bits of dirty laundry. Let's move on to today. There is, as everybody knows by now, disastrous things going on in my neck of the woods in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it was sparked, of course, as we all know, by the killing of a man by a cop. And I deliberately leave out the words black man. This was a human being that was killed by another human being, an individual who killed another individual. That is an issue of personal responsibility, not systemic racism. And we're not going to talk about racism on the show tonight. I've had my fill of that charge up to my eyeballs. This is about a guy who did something heinous to another guy. And the protesters and demonstrators, Black Lives Matter, who I have never been a big supporter of, I respect the fact that they all came out to protest and demonstrate what happened. And at the same time, the riots that have ensued since then are nothing of the sort. They are not the same thing as a protest and a demonstration against the local police, against the local government. When you start destroying your neighborhood and hurting your neighbors because one of your neighbors was hurt by a cop, that seems to me to be counterproductive to each other and not the same thing at all. Add to the fact that the Minneapolis police chief just yesterday announced that they have found that many of the the rioters were not even local to the area. They were shipped in on buses from other cities around the country to create havoc, to loot, to steal, to harm people, harm people's businesses in the neighborhood. How that in any way creates a counter-justice to the injustice that they saw in the murder of a man by a cop escapes me. You do not hurt your neighbors in order to protest an injustice. Unless your neighbors were part of the injustice, which what I have found, 170 businesses along the Lake Street District and around not only Minneapolis, but also in St. Paul, miles away. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, are really one big metro area with this kind of no man's land in between of businesses and factories and all that kind of stuff. But the whole area is being affected by this. And the rioting, the destruction of property, the hurting of people's businesses have little to nothing to do with the fact that a white cop killed a black man. A man killed a man. And that's what is the most heinous thing at the core of this issue. But the rest of this is something that has nothing to do with that at all. Anarchy and harming your neighbors is not a way to protest a heinous act or an injustice. Committing an injustice is not the same as fighting or protesting an injustice committed. All right. I'm going to start tangling my words if I keep trying to find different ways to say that. But that's what exists right now. And so in all of this, and some of the discussions I've had in social media and with other people offline, there has been a comparison made between the rioting in Minneapolis and the burning of people's businesses and the devastation up and down the Lake Street District. There's been a comparison made to the Boston Tea Party. And that seems to be the symbol that is always held up as some kind of answer to a justifiable riot. Well, let's look at the Boston Tea Party a little closer tonight, and let's see how it compares. So put on your history lesson caps and your steel undies, and let's dig into it. But first I want to say, I've had people say, well, you weren't there, you don't know. Well, you know what? Yeah, I live about an hour from Minneapolis right now. We're on the outskirts of the far eastern stretches of the Twin Cities metro area. We live out in the country, across the river and into Wisconsin. But Minneapolis-St. Paul is our city area, our metro area, and we go there all the time for business, for going out on the town, anything like that. So, also, I need to mention that I once had my own company, the Uptown Marketing Group, was housed in a building. It was called the Rainbow Building. It was on the corner of Hennepin and Lake, right across from the Calhoun Square Mall, right in the Lake Street District. The ground zero for all these riots was literally 3 or 4 blocks up the street in the Lynn Lake neighborhood of the Lake Street District. I was in the Uptown area of the Lake Street District, just a few blocks apart from each other, and I had a business there. And in the 90s, it was revitalizing that whole area, building it up, bringing businesses in, and over the last 25 years, the Lake Street District has really built up with a lot of big corporation businesses that have come in. You know, the Gap and other stores like that came in, but also tons of local businesses in little shops lined all up and down the Lake Street area. And those are the businesses that have been affected by this riot. Those local companies that are there to, some of them to serve the neighborhood, others to obviously run a business in the neighborhood, have all been affected by an injustice that's been perpetrated to supposedly protest an injustice. You know, my mom used to tell me when I was growing up, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And in this case, I don't care what your racial proclivities are. I don't care the way you view this event. When you harm other people, you lose your moral high ground. So, the Boston Tea Party. There's been a lot that's been said about this. I had people posting the Boston Tea Party and how it's in comparison to what's going on. Let's look at the Boston Tea Party. Now, I'm doing this kind of cold, folks. I haven't reviewed this history in a long time. So I just sat down today and I said, do I have to do hours of reading and research? No. I pulled up a few articles on the Boston Tea Party that I can reference, and of course my own head knowledge of it. Let's look at our own history. The Boston Tea Party was a political and mercantile protest by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts. And the Sons of Liberty was a secret organization, a revolutionary organization that was founded by Samuel Adams and the 13 colonies to advance the rights of the colonies and colonialists, and colonials of the European colonists, to fight taxation by the British government. And it played a major role in most colonies in founding the American Revolution. Now, it was against taxation. It was against the mercantile business. And it allowed, and in the largest target, of course, was the Tea Act of May 10th, 1773. And it was an act of Parliament of Great Britain. The principal objective was to reduce the massive amount of tea held by the financially troubled East India Company, owned by Britain, in its London warehouses, and to help the financially struggling company survive. Now, that was the Tea Act, and it allowed the British East India Company to sell tea from China in American colonies without paying taxes apart from those imposed by the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts refers to a series of British Acts of Parliament passed during 1767 and 68 relating to the British colonies in America. And the American patriots strongly opposed the taxes in the Townshend Act as a violation of their rights as British citizens. Demonstrators, some disguised as Native Americans, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the East India Company to Boston. It became known as the Boston Tea Party. They boarded the ships and they threw the chests of tea into the Boston harbor. The British government responded harshly, and the episode escalated eventually into the American Revolution. The Tea Party became an iconic event of American history, and since then, other political protests such as the Tea Party movement refer to themselves as historical successors to the Boston protest of 1773. And if you remember the Tea Party movement of a few years ago, it's an American fiscally conservative political movement within the Republican Party, or at least within the conservative point of view. And members of the movement have called for lower taxes and for a reduction of the national debt of the United States and the federal budget deficit through decreased government spending. That's what the modern Tea Party movement was all about. Now, the Tea Party in Boston in 1773 was the culmination of a resistance movement through British America against the Tea Act, which had been passed by the British Parliament in 1773. Now, colonists objected to the Tea Act because they believed that it had violated their rights as Englishmen to no taxation without representation. That is, to be taxed only by their own elected representatives and not by a British Parliament 3,000 miles away in which they were not represented. Now, in addition to this, the well-connected East India Company had been granted competitive advantages over colonial tea importers, who resented the move and feared additional infringement on their business. Protesters had successfully prevented the unloading of tea in 3 other colonies, but in Boston, embattled Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea to be returned to Britain. And so the Boston Tea Party was a significant event in the growth of the American Revolution. Parliament responded to it in 1774 with the Intolerable Acts, which is punitive laws that were passed by the British Parliament in 1774 after the Boston Tea Party. And the laws were meant to punish the Massachusetts colonies for their defiance in the Tea Party protest in reaction to changes in taxation by the British government. So colonists, and it was also called the Coercive Acts, which among other provisions ended local self-government in Massachusetts and closed Boston's commerce up tight. Now, colonists up and down the 13 colonies in turn, responded to the intolerable acts with additional acts of protest, and by conveying the First Continental Congress, which petitioned the British monarch for repeal of the acts and coordinated colonial resistance to them. And the crisis escalated, and the American Revolutionary War began near Boston in 1775. Now, mind you, this was all over excessive taxation by the British government on goods and services, and it also disallowed the Massachusetts colony especially, and the British colonies in America to act as their own representatives. It was taxation without representation. That was the drive behind the Boston Tea Party, which arose from two issues confronting the British Empire in 1765. The financial problems of the East India Company, the British East India Company, and an ongoing dispute about the extent of Parliament's authority, if any, over the British American colonies without seating any elected representative. The North Ministry's attempt to resolve these issues produced a showdown that would eventually result in revolution. Now, you got to look back to the tea trade, back to 1767, a few years earlier. As Europeans developed this taste for tea in the 17th century, rival companies were formed to import the product from China. And in England, Parliament gave the East India Company a monopoly on the importation of tea in 1698, almost 100 years earlier than the Boston Tea Party. When tea became popular in the British colonies, Parliament sought to eliminate foreign competition by passing an act in 1721 that required colonists to import their tea only from Great Britain. And since the colonists were British subjects, this is what the law became. And here in the colonies. And the East India Company did not export tea to the colonies. By law, the company was required to sell its tea wholesale at auctions in England. British firms bought this tea and exported it to the colonies, where they resold it to merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina. And until 1767, the East India Company paid an ad valorem tax. And that's a tax whose amount is based on the value of a transaction or of a property. And it's typically imposed at the time of a transaction, as is the case of the sales or value-added tax, the VAT that you see. Ad valorem tax may also be imposed annually, or as in the case of a real or personal property tax. And so, and this tax was 25% on tea that it imported into Great Britain. Now, Parliament laid additional taxes on tea sold for consumption in Britain. These high taxes, combined with the fact that tea imported into the Dutch Republic was not taxed by the Dutch government, meant that Britons and British Americans could buy smuggled tea at a much cheaper price. And so the biggest market for illicit tea, imagine, this is all over tea. This isn't even rum running. The biggest market for illicit tea was England. By the 1760s, the East India Company was losing 400,000 pounds per year to smugglers in Great Britain. That's a significant amount of money today. But Dutch tea was also smuggled into the British America in significant quantities. So in 1767, to help the East India Company compete with smuggled Dutch tea, Parliament back in Great Britain passed the Indemnity Act. And it refers to a series of British acts of Parliament that were passed relating to the British colonies in America. And this is part of it was the Townshend Acts. And the Indemnity Act lowered the tax on tea consumed in Great Britain and gave the East India Company a refund of the 25% duty on tea that was re-exported to the colonies. And so to help offset this loss of government revenue, Parliament also passed the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, which levied new taxes, including one on tea, in the colonies. So instead of solving the smuggling problem, the Townsend duties renewed a controversy about Parliament's right to tax the colonies. So, where you see it started about tea, it's more than the tea. It's about taxation. So the Boston Tea Party was one of the overt reactions to high taxes imposed on the colonies without representation in Parliament. Now, the Townsend Duty Crisis was a controversy between Great Britain and the colonies, and it arose in the 1760s when Parliament sought for the first time to impose a direct tax on the colonies for the purpose of raising revenue. Some colonialists, or colonists, known in the colonies as the Whigs, it was the Whig Party, the Whigs and the Tories. These were the colonists of the 13 colonies who rejected British rule during the American Revolution and declared the United States of America as an independent nation in July of 1776. That's who the Whig Party was. They objected to the new tax program, arguing that it was a violation of the British Constitution. And it was their constitution which also governed the colonies at the time. Britons and British Americans agreed that according to the Constitution, the British Constitution, British subjects could not be taxed without the consent of their elected representatives. Now, in Great Britain, this meant that taxes could only be levied by Parliament. Colonists, however, did not elect members of Parliament. And so American Whigs argued that the colonies could not be taxed by that body. So it was a taxation technicality, a governmentally representative technicality. And so according to Whigs, colonists could only be taxed by their own colonial assemblies. Colonial protests resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. But in 1766 Declaratory Act, that is, it was commonly known as the Declaratory Act, was an act of the Parliament of Great Britain which accompanied the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1765 and the changing and lessening of the Sugar Act. Parliament repealed this because the boycotts were hurting the British economy. So Parliament continued to insist that it had the right to legislate for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever, period, end quote. Even though the British Constitution said that taxation could not be levied without representation. So when new taxes were levied in the Townsend Revenue Act of 1767, Whig colonists lost their shit, and they again responded with protests and boycotts. Merchants organized a non-importation agreement. Many colonists pledged to abstain from drinking British tea. Imagine how big that was. With activists in New England promoting alternatives such as domestic Labrador tea up in Canada. And smuggling continued at a pace, especially in the New York and Philadelphia colonies, where tea smuggling had always been more extensive than in Boston. Dutied British tea continued to be imported into Boston. However, especially by Richard Clark. Now, Richard Clark was a loyalist. He was a loyalist to the crown. He was the son of William and Hannah Appleton Clark of Boston, where he was born, and he married Elizabeth Winslow, and so on. There's a history of him. But Richard Clark and the sons of Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, until pressure from Massachusetts Whigs compelled them to abide by the non-importation agreement. Parliament finally responded to the protests by repealing the Townsend taxes in 1770, except for the tea duty, which Prime Minister Lord North kept to assert the right of taxing the Americans. He said, we're not going to give it all up. We're going to tax those Americans, and we'll do it symbolically in the Tea Act. And so this partial repeal of the taxes was enough to bring an end to the non-importation movement by 1770. And from 1771 to 73, British tea was once again imported into the colonies in significant amounts, whole shipfuls of it, with merchants paying the Townshend duty of 3 pence per pound in weight of tea. And Boston was the largest colonial importer of legal tea. Smugglers still dominated the market in New York and in Philadelphia. And we got to end that right there for this segment. We're going to pick this up where we left off, start talking about the Tea Act of 1773. And this was hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars equivalent in modern day funds. All right, guys, sit tight. We're going to be right back. All right, folks, we're back. Thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also watch the simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel and join the live chat room going on amongst the Intrepheads right now, this moment, as I'm speaking, over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we're talking about the Boston Tea Party and all the events surrounding it, what led up to it, what was it, and how it is a false equivalency to the rioting that's going on today in Minneapolis and other riots that we've seen where the Boston Tea Party has been invoked. The Boston Tea Party was not a movement or not an event that took place to destroy local businesses and to destroy the lives and the livelihoods of their neighbors. It was imposed to protest the taxation on tea. Now, the Tea Act of 1773, the Indemnity Act of 1767, which gave the East India Company a refund of the duty on tea that was re-exported to the colonies, expired in 1772. Now, Parliament passed a new act in 1772 that reduced this refund, effectively leaving a 10% duty on tea imported into Britain. Now, that act also restored the tea taxes within Britain that had been repealed in 1767, and it left in place the 3 pence Townshend duty tax in the colonies. And so with this new tax burden driving up the price of British tea, sales plummeted. And guess who got to pick up the slack on that extra 10%? The American colonies. And so the company continued to import tea into Great Britain, however, amassing a huge surplus of product that no one wanted to buy. For these and other reasons, by late 1772, the East India Company, one of Britain's most important commercial institutions, was in serious financial crisis. And the severe famine in Bengal from 1769 to 1773 had dramatically reduced the revenue of the East India Tea Company from India, bringing the company to the verge of bankruptcy, and the Tea Act of 1773 was enacted to help the British East India Company survive. Now, eliminating some of the taxes is one of the obvious solutions to the crisis. The East India Company initially sought to have the Townshend duty repealed, but the North Ministry was unwilling because such an action might be interpreted as a retreat from Parliament's position that it had the right to tax the colonies. More importantly, the tax collected from the Townshend duty was used to pay the salaries of some of the colonial governors and judges. This was in fact the purpose of the Townshend tax. Previously, 3 officials had been paid by the colonial assemblies, but Parliament now paid their salaries to keep them dependent on the British government, rather than allowing them to be accountable to the colonists. So the colonists had absolutely no say on the officials that ruled over them. Another possible solution for reducing the growing mound of tea in the East India Company warehouses was to sell it cheaply in Europe. And this possibility was investigated, but it was already determined that the tea would simply be smuggled back into Great Britain, where it would undersell the taxed product. So the best market for the East India Company's surplus tea, so it seemed, was the American colonies, because it was across a 3,000-mile expanse of ocean, and in a way that could be found to make it cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea. And so the North Ministry's solution was the Tea Act, which received the assent of King George on May 10th of 1773. And this act restored the East India Company's full refund on the duty, the 25%, for importing tea into Britain, and also permitted the company for the first time to export tea to the colonies on its own account. Now, this would allow the company to reduce costs by eliminating the middlemen who brought the tea at wholesale auctions in London. Instead of selling to the middleman, the company now appointed colonial merchants to receive the tea on consignment. The consignees would in turn sell the tea for a commission. It's just business. They wanted to make a profit, and they found this as a way to do it. It was only business. You either buy a product at an inflated price or you don't. The problem was it was mandated by the British Crown. So in July 1773, tea consignees were selected in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston, and the Tea Act of 1773 authorized the shipment of 5,000 chests of tea. That's 250 tons of tea to the American colonies. And there would be a tax of about 1,750 pounds to be paid by the importers when the cargo landed. The act granted the EIC a monopoly on the sale of tea that was cheaper than the smuggled tea. Its hidden purposes was to force the colonists to pay a tax of 3 pennies on every pound of tea. And keep in mind, 3 pennies back then was different than 3 pennies now. So, the Tea Act thus retained the 3-pence Townshend duty on tea imported to the colonies. Now, some members of Parliament wanted to eliminate this tax, arguing that there was no reason to provoke another colonial controversy. And the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Dowdeswell, for example, warned Lord North, the Prime Minister, that the Americans would not accept the tea if Townshend duty remained. But North didn't want to give up the revenue from the Townshend tax, primarily because it was used to pay the salaries of colonial officials. Maintaining the right of taxing the Americans was a secondary concern. According to historian Benjamin Labaree, a stubborn Lord North had unwittingly hammered a nail in the coffin of the old British Empire. So even with the Townshend duty in effect, the Tea Act would allow the East India Company to sell tea more cheaply than before, undercutting the prices offered by smugglers, but also undercutting colonial tea importers. Now, there was resistance, as you know, for the Tea Act in the colonies. In 1773, 7 ships, September and October of 1773 specifically, 7 ships carrying East India Company tea were sent to the colonies. 4 were bound for Boston, and 1 each for New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And in the ships were more than 2,000 chests containing nearly 600,000 pounds of tea. Now, Americans learned the details of the Tea Act while the ships were en route, and opposition began to mount. Taxation without representation. Whigs, sometimes called themselves the Sons of Liberty, began a campaign to raise awareness and to convince or compel the consignees to resign, in the same way that stamp distributors had been forced to resign the Stamp Act of 1765. And the protest movement that culminated with the Boston Tea Party was not a dispute about high taxes. The price of legally imported tea was actually reduced by the tea of 1773. Protesters were instead concerned with a variety of other issues. The familiar no taxation without representation argument, along with the question of the extent of Parliament's authority in the colonies, remained the prominent issue. Samuel Adams, we all know him from his beer nowadays, considered the British tea monopoly to be equal to a tax. And some regarded the purposes of the tax program to make leading officials independent of the colony's influence as a dangerous infringement of colonial rights. This was a rights issue. And this was especially true in Massachusetts, the only colony where Townsend's program had been fully implemented. So colonial merchants, some of them smugglers, played a significant role in the protests because the Tea Act made legally imported tea cheaper, and it threatened to put smugglers of Dutch tea out of business. So again, business. Legitimate tea importers who had not been named as consignees by the East India Company were also threatened with a financial ruin by the Tea Act. And another major concern for merchants was that the Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade, and it was feared that this government-created monopoly might be extended into the future to include other goods and services. So in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, protesters successfully compelled the tea consignees to resign. In Charleston, the consignees had been forced to resign by early December, and the unclaimed tea was seized by customs officials. There were massed protest meetings in Philadelphia. Benjamin Rush urged his fellow countrymen to oppose the landing of the tea because the cargo contained the seeds of slavery, he called it. Slavery to the tyranny of the English crown. By early December, the Philadelphia consignees had resigned the tea ship, returned to England with its cargo, followed a confrontation with the ship's captain. The tea ship bound for New York City was delayed by bad weather, and by the time it arrived, the consignees had resigned, and the ship returned to England with all its tea on board. Now, the standoff in Boston that we're so familiar with. In every colony except Massachusetts, protesters were able to force the tea consignees to resign or to return the tea to England. In Boston, however, Governor Hutchinson was determined to hold his ground. He convinced the tea consignees, 2 of whom were his sons, not to back down. Oh, family business on top of it. And so when the tea ship, the Dartmouth, arrived in the Boston harbor in late November, Whig leader Samuel Adams called for a mass meeting to be held at Faneuil Hall on November 29th of 1773. I visited Faneuil Hall. The feeling of the place is downtown Boston. Just go, if you haven't been to Boston, go see the history in Boston. Faneuil Hall still stands there. And so they met, and thousands of people arrived, so many that the meeting was moved to the larger Old South Meeting House. And the British law required the Dartmouth to unload and pay the duties within 20 days, or custom officials could confiscate the cargo. In other words, unload it onto American soil. And the mass meeting passed a resolution introduced by Adams and based on a similar set of resolutions promulgated earlier in Philadelphia, urging the captain of the Dartmouth to send the ship back without paying the import duty. Meanwhile, the meeting assigned 25 men to watch the ship and prevent the tea, including a number of chests from Davison, Newman and Company of London, from being unloaded onto American soil. Now, Governor Hutchinson refused to grant permission for the Dartmouth to leave without paying the duty. 2 more tea ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor. On December 16th, the last day of Dartmouth's deadline, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 people out of a population of roughly 16,000 had gathered around the Old South Meeting House, after receiving a report that Governor Hutchinson had again refused to let the ships leave. Adams announced that this meeting can do nothing further to save the country. According to a popular story, Adams' statement was a prearranged signal for the Tea Party to begin. However, this claim didn't appear in print until nearly a century after the event, in a biography of Adams written by his great-grandson, who apparently misinterpreted the evidence. Now, according to eyewitness accounts, people did not leave the meeting until 10 or 15 minutes after Adams' alleged signal. And Adams, in fact, tried to stop people from leaving the meeting because it wasn't yet over. So while Samuel Adams tried to reassert control of the meeting, people poured out of the Old South Meeting House to prepare to take action. In some cases, this involved donning what may have been elaborately prepared Mohawk Native American costumes, while disguising their individual faces was imperative because of the legality of their protest. Dressing as Mohawk warriors was a specific and symbolic choice. It showed that the Sons of Liberty identified with America over their official status as subjects of Great Britain. And that evening, a group of 30 to 130 men, some dressed in the Mohawk warrior disguises, boarded 3 vessels, and over the course of 3 hours, dumped all 342 chests of tea into the waters of the Boston Harbor. And the precise location of Griffin's Wharf, the site of the Tea Party, has been subject to prolonged uncertainty, and a comprehensive study places it near the foot of Hutchinson Street, which is today's Pearl Street in Boston. Another tea ship intended for Boston, the William, had run aground at Cape Cod in 1773 in December, and its tea was taxed and sold to private parties. In March 1774, the Sons of Liberty received information that this tea was being held in a warehouse in Boston. They entered the warehouse and destroyed all the tea they could find. Some of it had already been sold to Davison, Newman and Company and was being held in their shop. On March 7th, the Sons of Liberty, once again dressed as Mohawks, broke into the shop and dumped the last remaining tea into the harbor. Now, as you can imagine, there was a reaction to this. Whether or not Samuel Adams helped plan the Boston Tea Party is kind of disputed, but he immediately worked to publicize and defend it. He argued that the Tea Party was not the act of a lawless mob, but was instead a principled protest and the only remaining option the people had to defend their constitutional rights. Now, at the same time, if you want to make any comparison to what's going on in Minneapolis and the kinds of riots that we see, there was no imposition of violence or destruction against private citizens. This was all marked on a cargo with a tax imposed without representation by the British Parliament against the colonies. It was a recognition or a statement by Parliament in Britain that the colonies were owned by Great Britain, that they could not govern themselves. So Samuel Adams argued that the Tea Party was not this lawless act, but instead a principled protest and it was the only option people had to defend their constitutional rights by the British Constitution. By constitution, he referred to the idea that all governments have a constitution, written or not, and that the Constitution of Great Britain could be interpreted as banning the levying of taxes without representation. For example, the Bill of Rights, 1689, this is the British Bill of Rights in 1689, established that long-term taxes could not be levied without Parliament. And other precedents said that the Parliament must actually represent the people it ruled over in order to count. So Governor Thomas Hutchinson had been urging London to take a hard line with the Sons of Liberty. If he had done what the other royal governors had done and let the ship owners and captains resolve the issue with the colonists, Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver would have left without unloading any tea. But back in Britain, even those politicians considered friends of the colonies were appalled, and this act united all parties against the colonies. The Prime Minister, Lord North, said, "Whatever may be the consequence, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." And so the British, and this is all financial, this is all about finance, this is all about who owns whom in a governmental setting, who has the power to represent themselves versus who does not. The British government felt this action could not remain unpunished, and responded by closing the port of Boston and putting in place other laws known as the Intolerable Acts. Benjamin Franklin stated that the destroyed tea must be paid for. All 90,000 pounds, which at 2 shillings per pound came to about 9,000 pounds, or 1.15 million pounds. In current rates, approximately 1.7 million U.S. dollars. Now, Robert Murray, a New York merchant, went to Lord North with 3 other merchants and offered to pay for the losses, but the offer was turned down. So the incident resulted in a similar effect in America when news of the Boston Tea Party reached London in January, and Parliament responded with a series of acts known collectively in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. And these were intended to punish Boston for the destruction of private property, even though there were private businessmen who offered to pay for it. And although the first 3, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, all passed by Parliament, applied only to Massachusetts, colonists outside that colony feared that their governments could now also be changed by legislative fiat in England. And the Intolerable Acts were viewed as a violation of constitutional rights, of natural rights, colonial charters, and united many colonists throughout America, exemplified by the calling of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774. Now, a number of colonists were inspired by the Boston Tea Party to carry out similar acts, such as the burning of the Peggy Stewart. And the Peggy Stewart was a Maryland cargo vessel that was burned in October 19th of 1774. And the event became known as the Annapolis Tea Party. And it all ended up, just in short, they gathered all the people together and they said, we're going to symbolically burn this ship. And they symbolically burned it. It was not a riot. Just so you know. So a number of colonists were inspired to do this. And the Boston Tea Party eventually proved to be one of the many reactions that led to the American Revolutionary War. In December of 1773, John Adams in his diary wrote this. It was on December 17th, 1773. John Adams said, "Last night, 3 cargoes of Bohea tea were emptied into the sea. This morning, a man of war sails. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history. That was John Adams. And notice how he refers to this act. It's an act of dignity, majesty, sublimity. It was daring, it was firm, it was intrepid, it was inflexible. Was anybody stealing people's property when they were doing this and looting their neighbors' shops? No. Rioting, destroying businesses for the sake of what you say outwardly is your cause, yet it is a thin cover for illegal, let's not even use illegal, subversive criminal activity. You can quote that you're doing this for a cause as you're running home with your new 52-inch television set over your head that you just acquired when you smashed in a building's windows and then burned it to the ground. In February 1775, Britain again passed the Conciliatory Resolution. This was a resolution that was made in an attempt to reach a peaceful settlement with the 13 colonies, immediately prior to the outbreak of the American Revolution. It ended taxation for any colony that satisfactorily provided for the imperial defense and the upkeep of imperial officers. The tax on tea was repealed with the Taxation Colonies Act of 1778, part of another parliamentary attempt at conciliation that failed. So the legacy of the Boston Tea Party. John Adams and many other Americans considered tea drinking to be unpatriotic following the Boston Tea Party. Maybe that's why he founded, it was Sam, his brother. Was it brother or cousin who founded the beer? Well, anyway, moving on. I'm being flippant. They considered to be unpatriotic to drink Boston or drink tea after the Boston Tea Party. And tea drinking declined during and after the Revolution, and resulting in a shift to coffee as the preferred hot drink. Yay for coffee. Did you know the American Revolution brought on coffee drinking? Bet you didn't know that. Hence the shirt that I have available. Quick plug. My Etsy page, etsy.com/shop/son-of-a-patriot. I've got my Boston t-shirt party in there. I prefer my coffee hot and my tea in the harbor against an emblazoned British colonial flag. So go get it. So before that time, the event was usually referred to as the destruction of the tea, the Boston Tea Party. Now, according to Young, American writers were for many years apparently reluctant to celebrate the destruction of property. And so the event was usually ignored in histories of the American Revolution. And this began to change in the 1830s, however, especially with the publication of biographies of George Robert Twelves Hughes, one of the few still living participants of the Tea Party, as it then became known. And so the issue was never the tax, but how the tax was passed without American input. United States Congress taxed tea from 1789 to 1872. So it wasn't about the tax. It was about the lack of representation in Parliament. And the Boston Tea Party has often been referenced in other political protests. Gandhi led a mass burning of Indian registration cards in South Africa in 1908. By the way, without destroying a single business or hurting a single person's income. And a British newspaper compared the event to the Boston Tea Party. When Gandhi met with the British Viceroy in 1930 after the Indian salt protest, Gandhi took some duty-free salt from his shawl and said, with a smile, that the salt was to remind us of the famous Boston Tea Party. And of course, we all know about the founding of the Tea Party movement in America. That's part of the legacy. So we're out of time. I wanted to say more about this, but you get the idea. The Boston Tea Party was in no way congruent with the rioting, the chaos, the havoc, and the burning of local businesses in order to protest the murder of one man by another man. That's all I got to say. Have a good night, folks. We'll see you tomorrow. No, we'll see you Sunday. Today's Friday. No show tomorrow. Sunday morning, 9 a.m. Central Standard Time for It's Sunday, right here on this channel, in the YouTube channel. Talk to you later.